Have you ever noticed that Gemini seems to understand things before anyone else does, but rarely explains how? It's as if their mind is already 3 steps ahead, quietly watching, connecting dots, and reaching conclusions while everyone else is still reacting. Gemini doesn't just think fast, Gemini thinks differently, and that difference shapes the way they experience people, emotions, conflict, and even life itself. If you're a Gemini, you've probably felt this your whole life. That subtle sense of being out of sync, of seeing what others miss, of realizing things earlier, but choosing not to say anything. And if you're not a Gemini, you've likely wondered why they seem calm when situations get intense, detached when emotions run high, or silent when everyone else is talking. In this video, we're going to uncover what actually happens inside the Gemini mind from a psychological perspective. Not surface-level astrology, not stereotypes, but the deeper mental structure that explains why Gemini processes reality in a way that feels foreign to most people. Before we go any further, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. These videos are for people who think deeply, reflect deeply, and want to understand themselves beyond labels. If that sounds like you, stay with me. Now let's break it down. There is something about the Gemini mind that people sense before they can explain. You notice it in conversations, in reactions, in the way Gemini listens more than they speak, and in the way their answers rarely come from emotion alone. Gemini doesn't process life in a straight line. While most people move emotionally first and intellectually later, Gemini often does the opposite. They observe, analyze, connect, detach, and only then decide how they feel about something. This creates the impression that Gemini is distant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable. But in reality, Gemini is simply operating on a different mental frequency, a frequency that prioritizes understanding over reaction. Gemini wants to know why something is happening before they allow themselves to fully feel it. This alone separates their mental structure from most other people. Gemini does not experience thoughts as brief interruptions. Thoughts are the main event. Their mind is constantly scanning, comparing, cross-referencing, and reframing information. While many people experience thoughts as reactions to emotions, Gemini experiences emotions as responses to thoughts. This means Gemini often understands what is happening before they emotionally feel it. This is why Gemini can appear calm in situations that overwhelm others. Not because they don't care, but because their mind has already mapped out the situation from multiple angles. Gemini sees patterns quickly. They recognize cycles. They detect inconsistencies in people's words and actions. And once something makes sense mentally, it loses much of its emotional power over them. This mental agility is both a gift and a burden. On one hand, it allows Gemini to adapt, communicate, and survive in almost any environment. On the other hand, it creates a sense of internal distance from life itself. Gemini is often watching life happen rather than fully drowning in it. They are participants, yes, but also observers. Another reason Gemini thinks differently is because their mind is not anchored to a single identity. Many people build their sense of self around fixed traits, beliefs, and emotional patterns. Gemini, however, is mentally fluid. They are constantly evolving their perspective. What they believed last year may no longer resonate today, not because they were wrong, but because they learned something new. This fluidity is often misinterpreted as inconsistency, but in truth, it is intellectual honesty. Gemini refuses to stay loyal to outdated ideas just for the sake of comfort. If new information appears, Gemini adapts. If a belief no longer fits reality, Gemini releases it. This makes them mentally flexible, but emotionally misunderstood. Gemini also has a unique relationship with detachment. Detachment for Gemini is not coldness, it is protection. When Gemini steps back emotionally, it is usually because they are trying to understand something clearly without being blinded by feeling. They know that intense emotions can distort perception, and Gemini values clarity above almost everything else. This is why Gemini often delays emotional reactions. They need time to process mentally first. Internally, they ask themselves questions most people never stop to consider. What is really happening here? What part of this situation is within my control? What part is not? What is the smartest response, not the loudest one? Because of this internal dialogue, Gemini often feels mentally older than their peers. Even at a young age, they tend to analyze life rather than simply react to it. They question social norms. They notice contradictions in people's behavior. They understand that emotions are temporary, but patterns are revealing. This gives Gemini a quiet maturity that doesn't always match their outward energy. However, this mental depth comes with a hidden cost. Gemini's constant thinking can create mental fatigue. Their mind rarely rests. Even when they are quiet, something is moving inside. Ideas connect to memories. Conversations replay with new interpretations. Scenarios are examined from different perspectives. Gemini is not overthinking out of anxiety. They are thinking because their mind is wired to understand. This is also why Gemini often struggles with being fully present. Their mind is always slightly ahead of the moment, interpreting what is happening while it happens. While others are immersed in emotion, Gemini is asking what this emotion means, where it came from, and where it might lead. Presence for Gemini is a skill they learn over time, not something that comes naturally. Another key reason Gemini thinks differently lies in their relationship with control. Gemini understands, often unconsciously, that not everything can be controlled. Instead of trying to dominate outcomes emotionally, they adapt mentally, they shift perspectives, they reframe experiences. This gives them a resilience that many people don't immediately recognize. When something doesn't work out, Gemini rarely collapses emotionally for long. They may feel disappointment, but quickly their mind begins restructuring the narrative. What did I learn? What changed? What does this reveal? This cognitive flexibility allows Gemini to recover faster than most, even if internally they feel more than they let on. This mental structure also explains why Gemini values communication so deeply. Words are not just expressions for Gemini, they are tools. Tools for understanding, connecting, clarifying, and processing reality. Gemini speaks to think, not just to be heard. And when they fall silent, it usually means their mind is doing important work behind the scenes. People often mistake Gemini's silence for disinterest. In reality, silence is where Gemini's deepest analysis happens. When Gemini stops talking, they are observing, recalibrating, and protecting their mental space. They are deciding what deserves their energy and what does not. This selective engagement is another reason Gemini appears emotionally controlled. They do not give reactions freely. They give them deliberately. Gemini understands that attention is currency, and not everything is worth investing in. This is not arrogance. It is mental economy. As we move forward, we're going to explore how this way of thinking affects Gemini's relationships, emotional boundaries, and inner world. What looks like detachment is often wisdom. What looks like inconsistency is often growth. And what looks like silence is often deep internal clarity forming. This is only the beginning. As we move deeper into how Gemini thinks differently, it becomes impossible to ignore how this mental structure shapes their relationships. Gemini does not connect the way most people do. While others bond primarily through emotional intensity or shared vulnerability, Gemini connects through understanding. They feel closest to people who stimulate their mind, challenge their perspective, and respect their need for mental space. This is why Gemini often appears selective, even distant in relationships. They are not avoiding intimacy, they are filtering it. Gemini knows that emotional closeness without mental alignment quickly becomes draining. If a connection lacks depth, curiosity, or intellectual respect, Gemini slowly disengages, sometimes without dramatic confrontation. not because they don't care, but because their mind has already concluded where the relationship is heading. Gemini rarely explains this process out loud. They observe patterns quietly, they notice how conversations feel, they sense whether growth is happening or stagnation is settling in. And once Gemini's mind reaches clarity, their emotional attachment begins to loosen naturally. This can feel confusing or even hurtful to others, but for Gemini, it is simply an internal decision rooted in self-preservation. This same mental structure explains why Gemini struggles with being misunderstood. Gemini often feels like they explain themselves clearly, yet still aren't truly seen. That's because much of Gemini's inner world operates at a level people don't immediately access. Gemini may communicate well, but they do not reveal everything they process. There is always a layer beneath the words, a silent awareness shaping their behavior. This creates a paradox. Gemini is known as a communicator, yet often feels unseen. They talk, but they also hold back. They share ideas, but protect conclusions. They participate socially, but remain internally independent. This balance allows Gemini to move through life with agility, but it can also create emotional distance when others expect more visible vulnerability. Another area where Gemini's thinking stands apart is emotional regulation. Gemini does not suppress emotions. They contextualize them. When something hurts, Gemini feels it, but immediately begins analyzing it. Why does this hurt? What expectation was broken? What assumption was incorrect? This mental framing reduces emotional chaos and transforms pain into information. This is where Gemini unknowingly aligns with Stoic principles. Gemini understands, often instinctively, that suffering increases when we resist reality. Instead of fighting what happened, Gemini adjusts their perspective. They focus on what can be learned, what can be controlled, and what must be released. This doesn't make them emotionless. It makes them resilient. However, this resilience sometimes comes at the cost of emotional exhaustion. Because Gemini processes so much internally, they often carry silent mental weight. They think for others. They anticipate outcomes. They manage emotional climates without announcing it. Over time, this can lead to a quiet fatigue that Gemini rarely talks about. This exhaustion is not physical. It is mental saturation. Too many thoughts, too many perspectives, too much awareness. Gemini's mind rarely shuts off completely, even in moments of rest. This is why solitude is essential for Gemini. Silence allows their mind to recalibrate, to slow down, to release mental residue accumulated from constant observation. Gemini also experiences identity differently. While many people define themselves by fixed traits, Gemini understands identity as something fluid. They allow themselves to change. They evolve their beliefs. They update their values. This flexibility can feel destabilizing at times, especially in a world that rewards consistency. But for Gemini, stagnation feels worse than uncertainty. This adaptability is often mistaken for lack of commitment. In reality, Gemini is deeply committed to growth. They refuse to become mentally rigid. They understand that life is dynamic, and so they remain mentally responsive rather than emotionally reactive. This makes Gemini excellent learners, observers, and strategists in life. When Gemini applies this way of thinking consciously, it becomes a powerful tool. Instead of feeling isolated by their differences, Gemini can learn to see their mental structure as an advantage. Their ability to detach allows them to see solutions others miss. Their analytical nature helps them avoid emotional traps. Their curiosity keeps them evolving rather than repeating cycles. But this power requires balance. Gemini must learn when to stop analyzing and start feeling, when to be present instead of predictive, when to trust connection without overthinking its outcome. Growth for Gemini is not about becoming more emotional, but about allowing emotion to exist without immediately dissecting it. When Gemini learns this balance, their mind becomes not just sharp, but wise. They move through life with clarity, intention, and emotional intelligence. They choose reactions carefully. They invest energy selectively. They understand that peace comes not from controlling everything, but from understanding what deserves attention and what does not. Ultimately, Gemini thinks differently because they are wired to understand life rather than be consumed by it. They observe before reacting. They reflect before committing. They learn before attaching. This makes them complex, sometimes misunderstood, but deeply intelligent in ways that go beyond words. If you are a Gemini, this video is an invitation to stop seeing your mental difference as a flaw. It is not something to fix. It is something to master. When you understand how your mind works, you gain the ability to move through life with clarity instead of confusion, intention instead of impulse, and calm instead of chaos. And if you're still here, it means this resonated with you on some level. So take a moment now, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. More content like this is coming, designed for minds that think deeply and seek understanding beyond the surface. And let me know in the comments, did this describe you or someone you know? Your awareness might be more powerful than you realize.